Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. I'm Ty Fischer, the head of school here at Veritas Academy, and your host. Around the table, we have today a group that I think I could affectionately call the Fun Bunch.
Wow.
Now, that's going to bring back some memories there, Mr. Etter, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a raise or a promotion.
I think it's
Fun
promotion.
bunch.
I believe promotion's in order. Yeah.
Wasn't that a group in the old Washington Redskins teams, the Fun Bunch, where they would all gather around and they would all jump up and high-five each other?
I can't remember. Is that when they used to win games?
That's it. I'm sorry.
Then that's beyond memory.
The Washington what?
No,
Yeah.
I didn't catch the mascot.
We'll have to edit that out, I guess. So I'm here with our Dean of Students, Graham Dennis, our Dean of Humane Letters, Bruce Etter, and our Principal, Dr. Dan Spanjer. And today we're going to be having a conversation about why we should teach students to love reading for the sake of good literature. So how can the great books be beneficial, and why read just for the fun of it? And not just read articles on Facebook for the fun of it, but read the great books for the fun of it.
Can I answer the question by disagreeing with your premise?
Oh, golly.
I love this already.
This is getting fun.
Here we go.
Here we go. No, actually, I'm not going to.
Would you mind if I put my head down on the table?
Yeah, so I don't disagree, but I will say as a historian that the reason to read the great books in my mind comes with something additional to enjoying them, which I think is essential.
Okay.
So I'm not disagreeing, I'm adding on.
No, okay, and what is that add-on?
And I think the add-on is that what history shows is that it only makes sense if there are things that endure. And I think we're in a moment now where we want to think that the human experience and whatever we feel in the moment is the reason for the moment. Until you, and I've had students say, you read the ancient Greeks and go, wait a minute, that explains me really, really well, and you get to know yourself better by seeing in those permanent things when they're expressed really well who you are.
Yeah, and maybe I think the way I was thinking about it is that's one of the ways, that's one of the reasons out there, but that is so true. You know, I'm a Dante fan. And when I read the Divine Comedy, I tell people it's hard. It's very challenging. You know, Dante expects you, he looks up and tells you where the stars are, and he expects you to know what day it is in the year 1300 because you would chart the stars. But it's difficult. But after a number of readings, I liken it to life without Dante is black and white. Life with Dante is Technicolor.
Ooh, I haven't heard that word in a while.
He gives you a palette of colors that you just didn't even know about. So, thank you, Dr. Spanjer, for disputing the discussion before we even started, folks. I wish that was a strange happening here at Veritas, but so often,
All too normal, sadly.
So often here at Veritas, someone starts speaking, and someone raises their hand and says I disagree with the whole premise of this. That's why we accomplish things slowly here at Veritas Academy. So tell us about your background in teaching, and especially in teaching the great books and in classical Christian education. We'll just go around the horn here.
Yeah, just real quickly, I've taught omnibus for years, and I've become sort of the medieval person. The irony of that is when I first came here, I told Ty, I am really good at ancient and modern. And like a lot of people, you know, my medieval education was fine, but it was probably the most lacking of the three. And Ty said, why don't you have multiple sections of medieval, right? But no, I've taught for 16 years. I've taught, I would say, primarily omnibus here at Veritas Academy.
Sometimes people are listening to this that are not, and interestingly, many of the prospective parents that now show up here say, you know, hey, we checked out the podcast before we came. So could you, Graham, or maybe I should,
I can do it quickly.
Okay, well, what is omnibus?
Yeah, so we divide up our curriculum in history, theology, and literature into what we think of as periods in which we're studying the great books. So we have 2 cycles of ancient, medieval, modern. So 7th is ancient, 8th is medieval, 9th is modern, then we go through that cycle again. I teach 8th grade medieval and 11th grade medieval. So the first time through and the second time through. And just to give you an idea of what I'm doing, we're trying not to read a Western Civ book about that time period, but to actually read texts that were written during that time period.
So that's a great definition of omnibus there, Graham. So Bruce, go ahead with your background.
Well, that'll help my explanation go a little faster too. So I 20 years ago, Ty needed a Spanish teacher, and being Puerto Rican, I thought I can do that. So
what are you talking about, Bruce? You can't
no
just
cameras. It
you
may be
can't just
accurate for
lie
listeners.
on the podcast.
Okay, fine, Mexican. But
No,
anyway,
you're not Mexican or Puerto
all right. I am not.
You're from
neither.
West Virginia,
But
Bruce.
I am a Spanish teacher.
Okay.
And he is fluent in Spanish.
I'm fluent in Spanish. So I applied for the job.
So Graham, was the assumption in your last comment that Veritas would hire a Spanish teacher who did not know Spanish?
I think Bruce is trying to tell us that he's got some serious cred, but lying about his past in order to do so.
Yeah.
Because I don't actually look like someone who would speak Spanish
No, you
at
don't.
all. No. So I needed a Spanish teacher. I applied for the job, and I got the job. And then after a year of teaching Spanish, Ty said, "Oh, by the way, need you to teach omnibus." So thank you, Graham, for breaking down the years so your listeners now will better understand what I mean when I say he wanted me to teach omnibus 1, ancient books. And
Ancient books to 7th graders.
ancient books to 7th graders. So Plato and Livy and so forth, Virgil and so forth to 7th graders. And from day one, I fell absolutely in love with ancient literature because Ty made me study it in depth so I could teach it well.
Yeah, well, and one of my favorite moments, and I think you were involved in this, was we had a young man who was an 8th grader, ended up being a really great athlete, but he asked his parents for a leather-bound version of Herodotus for his Christmas, like in his 8th grade year. Because,
Landon.
Yeah.
Not too many of those showing up in the sock
Christmas
hanging over
list,
the
Yeah,
over the
for
fireplace.
for 8th graders.
It's usually Thucydides, let's be honest.
Yeah.
That's why.
How true is that?
So, Dr. Spanjer.
Yeah, so I come into this a little backwards because I came through standard Christian education. We didn't do a lot of great books, but fell in love with history, and then through trying to understand the historical eras where most of my PhD work was done, and then my teaching afterwards was you really can't understand it until you read the actual text. So I came in it backwards, but I think for me it's just come alive in my recent career. And teaching here, I still teach more history, but in the side and trying to learn more about it, I spend much more time in the primary text now.
And I came at it, I don't know which way I was going, but basically, I've been head of school here for, I think, 28 years now. And when I arrived, the school was in its 2nd year, and no curriculum existed for classical Christian education. I actually had something that looked like a computer, but it was really just a typewriter.
Oh, word processors.
Oh, yeah, one of those old word processor things. And that's how that started. I would punch out a bunch of stuff. So, and the biggest project that I've worked on for about a decade was the Omnibus Project with Doug Wilson and Gene Veith. So we're trying to both pass on a cultural heritage. We're trying to actually give students answers for actual real concerns and issues that they're dealing with in their real life. We're also trying to help them love reading. So how did you each come to be readers?
Yeah,
so we'll go this way.
Yeah, that's good because we blue collar family, and my parents are very much involved in labor. My mom was a teacher, but my dad was a farmer, and that was my life. And reading always seemed like a bit of a distraction until I found science fiction and some fun things to read. And then but that was an unserious approach to it. I enjoy that sort of thing. But it wasn't until I think seminary and then grad school where I realized there are some things you can't learn any other way. Mm-hmm. And if you're really curious and you want to know, you've got to deal with the text of it. I mean, a YouTube video is great, and you can skim off the pond if you want, but if you need time to digest, you've got to deal with the words, and the words are written. And when they're written, you start to pull them apart, they start to get inside you, and they help you rethink. I want to add one thing to what you said, and this is what reading's helped me with. I don't think I know the questions to ask to get answered, and what reading has taught me is to ask questions I didn't even know I was trying to ask.
Yeah.
And it is inspiring.
Yeah. What about you, Bruce?
Do you guys remember Hamburger Helper?
Yes, I do.
Do you?
Called my college career and
That's
seminary
college
life.
career.
Yeah.
Make a great meal.
Boy, I say, okay.
Graham even remembers
The
the
jingle.
jingle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bruce,
Graham, for someone
It's a
who is
Wayback Machine.
for
Bruce-
someone who's in as good a shape as you are, that's a little bit
Disconcerting.
disappointing and disconcerting. Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I think that I would say, unfortunately, most of my college experience, not as much in seminary, but I would say that a lot of my college experience was Hamburger Helper in terms of the books that even professors had me read. I don't think I knew there was much else out there. So when I started reading the books that I had to read and dive into them to study to teach omnibus, I felt like someone took my Hamburger Helper away and put a big fat fillet down on the plate, and it was quite delicious. And that's honestly when I really came to love reading and
yeah.
books and such.
Graham, how about you?
My dad, his senior year, switched from a business degree. His parents wanted him to study business and to lit, and they ended up being a literary agent. So I was always surrounded by books. He was an editor and then later a literary agent, but he was committed to reading to us. So I will say my first love for reading, and actually, by the way, what you're talking about at the beginning is what we might call the leisure of reading, where you do something for it's the joy that it has in itself, not as a utility for something else, but actually just the sheer joy. I actually learned first by listening. So my dad read Lord of the Rings, MacDonald, Lewis. So I listened, and I learned to love listening.
Yeah, your family's like an ad for classical Christian education.
Well, the interesting thing, though, is like Dan, I didn't have a great education, and I actually didn't learn to love reading myself until college. So my parents, planted the seeds, but my actual love for reading came much later.
Yeah. Well, for me, I grew up in a Scots-Irish family, very argumentative. So you usually read things so that you could have weapons to use, because we were the upper crust of the hillbilly elegy, and that meant that we argued with words. The other peasants argued with knives and guns. So, but in that setting, I thought I was a reader in high school, and I read a lot of interesting books. I'll give you for instance. We would have a fun photo, like our football team would have all the serious photos, where, in football, you don't smile, you kind of like look mean. But then we would have one fun photo, and you could like have one prop that you held with you, and, it made the whole team look a lot more interesting than we actually were. And my freshman year, I'm holding a book, the Robert Bork's book on how to interpret the Constitution. So, like, I was very interested in reading. I just didn't know anything. Now, I was a decent athlete in high school, so everyone was, I think they were patting me on the back because I was like an athlete that could read. So I was, that was like we had some that were really good students, but somebody asked me here, what would happen if a student's failing a class here at Veritas, they're not academically eligible to play sports until they take care of that academic issue. And someone asked me what would happen if a basketball player failed a class in Indiana, and I said, well, there you go. No, what you don't know is that no basketball player has failed a class in Indiana.
Miraculously.
It's a hypothetical.
Yeah. It's like, no, there have been teachers that have been dismissed mid-year, but there's no basketball player that fails a class. So I think I got the gentleman's A, and then went off to college and ran into, in the Grove City History Department, Dr. David McKillop, and he just helped me to love history, and as I loved history, he would give me good books to read, And, we're sitting here in my office, and many of the books that I have on my shelves are books that he would have recommended to me. And then I went to seminary and ran into so many great professors that just fed that part of my life. So, and that's kind of where the passion for reading came from for me. So, but we're in a different time now. So how has inspiring the love of reading become more challenging in this technological age, especially to encourage young people to have the love of reading or the capacity to read substantive things?
Yeah.
Graham, are you stealing a book from my office?
I was going to use it later.
Okay,
It's a
okay,
prop.
that's fine. It's okay.
He was going to hit Bruce over the head with it. Yeah, that's a tough question. I think we're all trying to get our hands around that because reading is hard, and I think you said that initially. It's a hard thing to do, and it takes time. And I think the other thing right now is value is in opinion. People feel if they've got a passion opinion, that somehow is discourse. And so reading, the one thing about reading is it makes opinion harder. You have to deal with more complexity, and things get more difficult. And you don't end up in certainty. Oftentimes, you end up having to ask questions you didn't mean to ask. And I find with people that the more they read, the more they're circumspect and the more they're careful about their opinion. They go, well, this is true, and I don't think there's a high prize on that. I think our culture really wants certainty and I would say not critical thinking, I would say critical emoting. They want you to emote about the right things the right way. And reading challenges that. It forces you to ask harder questions, and it's not easy to come up with real clear, certain, solid opinions on things oftentimes.
So you're just maybe hoping that reading makes all of our students wishy-washy? Is that what you're saying?
No, but I am saying that reading will force students to ask questions they didn't know they had to ask before. And it doesn't change your convictions, but I'm talking about public opinion. You know not to jump out and go, this is the easy answer to that. I hate all people that are on that side. And then you have to read that side and read more, and you go, well, okay, it is complicated. I have to think more about it. And we talk about critical thinking. It's probably not the right word for it, but I think the more you read, the more you're challenged to do that, and the less you have very simple, straightforward, like this is the way it is. And it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast with Guelzo, the historian. He was talking about Lincoln's second inaugural, and wouldn't that have been a great time just to say, darn right, we're right, they're wrong, we whooped them.
Right.
And he said, with malice toward none, with charity for all.
Yeah.
Like those folks down there, they're us.
We're all part of the union somehow.
Yeah. So, Bruce, you want to?
Yeah. Graham and I meet up at the coffee machine. What, Graham? 3-4 times a day?
I think that's
as often as we possibly can.
Yeah.
That's not a cafe, by the way.
Yeah.
That's an actual coffee. It sounded like a cafe.
Well, yeah, and the problem we have now is that it's near our boss's office, and that makes it a little more complicated. So we have to kind of up the ante on what we talk about. But I'd say if we meet 3 times a day, 2 of those 3 times is this question. It's driving us bonkers. Mm-hmm. It really is, and we've talked a lot about it. I do have a few thoughts I want to share. The fact that we can't compete with the technology kids have. They have phones and they have video games and such. We have to stop trying. I think that's the first thing. So the fact that we've kind of lost our kids on books to that tells me that maybe we weren't stressing the right things in the first place. So 2 things that come to mind for me. There is absolutely no substitute for a kid looking at a teacher whom he admires and respects and sees, wow, look at how much he loves this stuff. Mm-hmm. And obviously it has to be genuine. You can't fake that. If you don't love it, then go teach something else or go do something else. That's, I think we gotta unleash that reality. Rather than just, well, I'm disseminating information and you have to know these points of theology from Aquinas or whatever. Do we really love it? The other thing you guys are going to have to remind me, I bet Graham knows, there's Lewis, Lewis writes a lot about books and stories and why we like them and so forth. And I don't remember what book it is where he talks about the reason we return to certain books. And it's not because we don't remember the plot. It's not any of those. It's because that story took us to a place, and we want to go back to that place. Does anybody remember?
Man, it sounds like some.
Maybe it's in discarded image.
I was thinking abolition of man. I was getting a little vibe
Okay,
of that.
we'll have to look that one up for later. But we all know how we feel when we've gone either on a vacation or we've gone somewhere that was just magical.
I think it's surprised by joy when he's describing
I think
the
you're right.
experience
I think
as a
you're right.
child. Remember that little world he made?
Okay.
And then he'd get the books.
Okay.
And he couldn't wait to enter into this new world, and then he was sad having to leave that world.
Boy.
And then he creates it with Narnia.
Graham's like
Right.
the internet.
Literally.
He's like the Lewis internet.
I just web scraped.
You web scraped.
For those of you listening, I want to verify that Graham did not
Did not.
use any electronic device to come up with that.
And actually, while you were talking, his eye was running across the ceiling back around as his brain was searching for
His
it.
eyes were moving very rapidly.
Very rapidly, yeah.
Yeah, so something was going on. But those two things, we gotta be excited about what we're doing and let our students see that. And if they respect and love us, then they're gonna want to know more about what we love so much. And then teaching story as a place that that a good author takes you
A happy place.
a happy place, or even a sad place that maybe you learned some stuff.
Yeah.
And then you got out of. That's why we read Dostoevsky.
To leave Dostoevsky.
I got to get my Dostoevsky plug in at some point.
Bruce, I want to just piggyback on that. And there are studies done that say that reading in front of your children is just about as impactful as reading to your children.
Right. That makes sense.
So when they see that parents value reading, it's very persuasive. It's so critical to not get lost in the weeds of just trying to go through a process and check boxes. You have to love the stuff in front of them,
Right.
for them to love it.
And I'll finish with this. Yeah, that's, those two things really can't be replicated in the competition, which is the phone and the video game. You can't, they can't get those two things there.
Graham,
Just super quickly, a little analogy. My mom and my wife both did these brilliant things with food for children. My wife would only feed our kids when they were in the earliest baby food stage, beets, mashed peas, carrots, spinach, squash. She never gave them the sweet fruit baby food. And the reason why is you don't have to educate your palate to like, applesauce. You do have to educate your palate to like, peas and squash and beets and so on and so forth.
do your kids still like all these things?
Yeah. So my mom,
That's the indication of success.
my mom had a rule, and the rule was, it was called the list. It was a very short list. There were two things we were exempt from eating. These aren't entrees. These are two individual items. So as a kid, my list was beets and cauliflower. But then we couldn't just keep switching. Your list was your list, and mom would allow like one change.
You pick like a football team.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't change.
And then I realized, you know what? We don't have beets
fantasy
enough.
team.
So I'm
Cauliflower.
gonna make a more calculated choice. I'm gonna risk the possibility that I might have to eat beets and add something else to it, right? So, but what happened is I've had my kids do this in my class. Can you name something Mr. Dennis doesn't like? And the answer is no. My mom and my wife have tried to set things up so that my palate would be attuned to great tastes. And that's what my wife has tried to do with my children. The problem that we have with our culture is that we're giving our kids sweet things, and you don't have to train the palate to like sweet things, right? The kinds of entertainment that we have are just like the sweetest thing that you stick in your mouth and you don't train, you immediately love it, right?
But you would never want to go back to it.
Right. We all know that sick feeling from having too many sweet things, right? But the irony is that if you learn to eat only sweet things, you desire good, your body desires and hungers for good food, but you can't eat it. And so there's a training of the palate that you actually learn not only to eat foods that you have to be trained to like, anchovies, mushrooms, things that you might not naturally like, but then you're free to eat really good food.
Yeah.
In fact, you prefer it to the food that's, easier on your palate.
You eat kale? Kale's the one
I
thing.
can eat kale.
I can eat kale. Do you like it?
Yeah, I do. So
Do you like lima beans? I think that's why I draw the line at lima
love
beans.
lima beans,
No, I can't
man.
stand lima beans.
So I think the tough thing that we're facing is that our parents need to realize that the culture is constantly giving our kids hyper sweet, super sweet soft drinks. And that if you don't train their palate to like things that they wouldn't as naturally choose or be inclined to, they're only going to be gravitating towards sweet soft drinks.
So the healthy food that we try to put in front of students are these things called the great books. So that's one of the healthy things we try to put in front of them. Well, how can we, and maybe the food analogy is a good analogy, but how can we help parents? So, sometimes, I see the glass eyes of parents who are transferring into Veritas. You're going to read what with them? Yeah, we read Beowulf in 4th grade, and they're like, ooh. So how can we get parents to see the value of what reading these books really does for their children?
And I'm gonna tie into something because it's interesting. There's 2 sets here, and I'm all alone, so maybe I can't call it a set. But on the literature side, Graham and Bruce are really, and I think probably Ty, you're maybe a bridge between us, which works out well. But on the literature side, taste and palate are important words, and on the history side, and not that they're entirely against one another, but I think wisdom is a really important word here. That, again, I think if you were to say what's attractive, what tastes good, I think reductionism always tastes good, right? You want to boil things down to a quip where you can get your hands on it, where you know who's good and who's bad and who you like and don't like. And you use this analogy one time, Ty. I think there's like you've got a picture in front of you to color, and you've only got 6 colors to use. You're gonna. But if you have 200 colors, you've got all new nuance to work with. And I do think that it's attractive to reduce. It's attractive and it tastes good, and it's easy to get it down and boiled into a quick opinion. But I think that what parents need to see is when your students read, you're taking the truth. It's not that it's any more true, but you're showing dimensions where students get to explore the complexity of things, and it forces them to be wise. If you want a student to engage in their life, to ask big questions about where they're going in life, give them a palette, a range of colors, give them 200, 300 colors to color with, so that they don't jump into situations and just react. Christians can do this too, as well as non-Christians can. But read with depth, and all of a sudden you become dissatisfied with really simple answers. Like, don't give me it's just that. I know it's more than that. And I think parents need to see that your students will come out able to be sober, to balance things, to ask solid questions, and be wise. I think that's important.
Well, and especially as a historian, the thing that I found about history is it's not that summary is boring.
Yeah.
The interesting things in history are those things that happen down in the weeds. Right. Like, and when you know those stories, it's fun that all of history then is interesting because it's connected to things sometimes happen in history that are more impressive than fiction.
Yeah, right.
So,
Mind if I jump in on that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ty rescued me from car sales. I was a car salesman.
So that has fiction writer aspect.
I'm not sure
to
we
it.
believe that
All
one.
over
Go
it,
on.
right there. In another life, yes, I was a car salesman. One of the best ways I found to sell a car is if somebody was close to buying the car, I'd just hand them the keys and say, Mr. Jones, just take it home. Just take it home and keep it for 24 hours. And there's about a 99% chance that Mr. Jones is going to get that new car smell stuck up in his nostrils, and he's going to fall in love with it. There ain't no way, to use some of my good West Virginia French, there ain't no way he's giving that car back. He's going to buy it. So with the great books, I think that we've got to find more ways for our parents to experience the joy of it themselves. You know, not merely the end result of it, but the actual thing itself. So how do we do that? We include them in our reading list. I know some parents do actually read the books along with the students while we're doing them. Having them in class, I don't think is a terrible idea. I know there's some logistical issues with just having parents in high school classes all the time. But
students really want to talk then.
Yeah, having them interrupt class. That's
true.
They're going to love that.
But, you know, you kind of be wise about it. And then, you know, there are adult book clubs out there.
There might be one or two.
The Alyosha Society.
Oh.
And, you know, so I see that the adults in my book club, they are many of them are falling in love with the great books for the first time. They kind of knew, well, I think I need to do this for my kids. And maybe a Ty Fischer or someone convinced them, but they never read them.
Yeah.
They never read them before. And they're in their mid-50s and they're falling in love with literature.
Yeah, I often get to read Anna Karenina with some students, usually seniors, and it's always been really fun for me to watch. That book is a really good. It's a long book, so it's intimidating initially, and then you see students kind of like, oh, this is interesting. And then our first international student here at Veritas was a young lady named Lisa Ma. And I think when I handed out Anna Karenina, I could just see her like soul drop. And she started reading it and just started loving it. And every day she would come in and she would say, I have 2 questions. She would always come back every night after the reading with 2 questions. So what advice would you give to parents who want to inspire a love of reading outside of school? We're recording this right now on the edge of summer, and that's an important time. I think you really know that your kids love reading when they have a lot of leisure time, and they'll use some of it for that. I think that there's a bad thing where you would use all of your leisure time for reading, because you don't need to just hang out with dead people all the time. You need to go out and hit a baseball or something like that. So any advice for parents?
I'll start on this one. Well, you berate them. You make them feel really stupid, and you tell them that they're going to be working at the drive-thru for the rest of their lives.
Bruce is not a trained psychologist. Remember, he's a car salesman. So
I used to give a talk I think I did this one at ACCS, where the whole thing was the opposite of what, top 10 ways to cause kids to hate the great books. The thing that comes to my mind here, if you want your child to learn how to ride a bicycle, for example, you don't throw them on the 10-speed when they're 4. You start with the tricycle. You start with the little 20-inch or whatever, 16-inch with the training wheels and so forth, and then they go up from there. And this one might be a little bit controversial, but that just makes it more fun, doesn't it?
Okay, we'll see.
I think that what we have to do is you have to figure out where what the child's sweet spot is in terms of ability. I'll give you an example. I hated reading until I was in my mid to late 20s, because when I was in 3rd grade, a teacher gave me a copy of Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. And she said, you should be able to read this book and understand it. I didn't understand a word of that book. And so I grew up with not only just kind of a hatred of reading, but a fear of it. I was scared to death of it. You've got to rewind. You got to go find out. And so even start maybe just a little bit below that student's reading level or appreciation level, whatever the case may be. Look, if that means they start with Harry Potter, then they start with Harry Potter. Something has to generate that spark.
You've got to get traction.
You got to get traction. You know what? They'll be reading Homer down the road, but you may not want to throw that at them at first.
So
if that makes any sense.
I usually talk about it like you're baking a cake, and a cake needs flour and sugar, but you shouldn't let me bake a cake for you. But sometimes you're going to need to give a little bit more sugar, and then you can go with more flour later on. Right. So, and that's some of the funnest stories from the early years of reading the great books are when you don't know the right mix of flour and sugar. So
and you could look at the same thing with maybe music.
Yeah.
A kid's just not going to like Bartok on day one.
No.
But they might understand and appreciate Bartok if you start them off with a little Mozart or a little Bach or something like that.
I was reading along with the kids, so I wasn't out in front of them. This was probably third year here at Veritas, so it's 25 years ago. I assigned 50 pages of Aristotle's Ethics to read that night. And I remember the Nicomachean Ethics. I went home and I sat down to read, and I remember I started and I got to the end of the first paragraph and I said, got nothing. I started again, got to the end of the paragraph and I'm like, got nothing again.
That day fishing.
Then I started reading through it again, got to the end of the first paragraph, and I said, oh no. And there was no the internet was just, Al Gore was still
hadn't gotten there yet.
Getting it up and running then. And I would have texted or emailed the students, but I had no way to contact them. And I thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe what I've done. And I had 5 students in the class at that time. I went back in and 3 of them were happy and joyful. They had quit after the first paragraph. And the other 2 looked like death warmed over.
Did Lisa Ma show up with 2 questions?
No, it didn't. No, it would have been.
Why did you make us read this? And will you ever do it again?
Right.
There's your 2 questions.
Yeah.
Can I jump in that too? Because I think one of the other things about it is it may be intimidating, but I think there's a reason to just do it. And I found a couple times I've gotten a friend and say, look, I really want to read Tolstoy. Let's just do it. Let's commit to doing 2 chapters a night, and we'll hold each other accountable. And I found there's a lot of fruit that comes out of that, because you, on your own, you started something. You started Dostoevsky, and and 5-6 chapters in, you bail out. And you really, I think, like the appetite and the palate do build. And I would just encourage anybody out there, if there's something you've always wanted to read to get you started, just do it and stick with it. And I think you're going to go through a little lull where it's going to be tough, but you're going to find when you stick with it, 2 things happen. 1, you're going to find things you didn't find. Number 2, you're going to be able to say, I actually read Augustine when you meet your friends. And if nothing else, let that be. Let that be an incentive.
Well,
I finished Brother Karamazov. That's a bucket list.
Let that arrogance drive you forward.
Let it drive you. Hey, listen, if that's what gets you into great books,
Could
I think for the time being.
I would say too, though, Bruce, I think that you hit on this earlier, and that is, someone once made a sign that said it's not safe to read alone. And I've found that a lot of times if you can get a group of people together who are interested in, you took a group of people through Calvin's Institute.
All the way through Calvin's Institute. Took us 2.5 years.
Yep. So I was at a church reading group once, and we were doing Calvin's Institutes, and it was 6 o'clock on Saturday mornings. 6 o'clock on Saturday mornings.
Calvin works at that.
No,
hour.
I know. But I liked Calvin's Institute so much. I'd be like, "There's no way I'm going," and then I'd wake up and I'm like, "I'm going." I'm going. Like, we have a group of people that want to sit and talk about the Institute. So.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
There is a myth there, I think, that, and you kind of hit upon it, Ty, with your Aristotle's Ethics, that a relatively smart person should be able to pick up just about any text and read it and get a whole lot out of it. I don't think that's true. I think really smart people, I think you're a fairly smart guy. And if you picked up Aristotle and had trouble with it, then how much more? It reminds me when Aeneas went into the underworld, having been beckoned there by his father, he had a guide. He had the Sibyl.
Yeah.
And then Dante, going through, Inferno, Purgatorio, has Virgil as his guide. So you have these stories where, great people needed a guide. And so, one of my foundational sort of ideas with teaching is students sometimes say, I hate reading, I hate books, blah, 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 blah. I don't think they hate books. I don't think they hate reading. I think they don't understand what they're reading. Mm-hmm. And once they start to understand it, they will love it. Yeah. So we got to figure out, how to be that guide or show them how. You know what? Sometimes you might have to Google something and just look it up and get that traction. And then once you get the traction, you can let the training wheels go, and maybe you don't.
And I think there's another point to that too, and that is don't be worried if you are intimidated. You read things you don't understand it, and then people, I got to stop. I don't think that's valuable. I don't think you're trying to be I would tell students, you're not trying to be a scholar in it. You want to be exposed to it. You want it to seep into you. And so maybe you don't get all of Dante or Lost on one canto. If you're going to sit and try to figure it all out, move on to the next canto. See what you can learn.
So Wes Callahan gave me the advice. He said, Dante's Divine Comedy is the best book outside of Scripture ever. And he said, what you have to do is you have to read it the first time and expect to get nothing out of it.
Right.
And he
that's
said,
okay.
Just press through.
Yeah, that's
and then
okay.
he said, go back to it, and it gets sweeter and sweeter and better and better. But let's wrap this up with, what are some books, if you're going to give some recommendations to parents of books that might be ones that can start to help a teenager get that kind of appetite for reading good books in leisure time. Any recommendations?
I'll start with a few. This is the low-hanging fruit, but Tolkien.
Okay.
Someone's going to say Lewis.
I just assumed that everyone was going to jump in and say Lord of the Rings.
I was saying Lewis. Yeah, it's just.
Well, so I was gonna say Lewis's Till We Have Faces. It just, like, I couldn't put the book down the first time I got it. It's so interesting. Lewis thought it was his best book.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I think the reason why we don't discount, and maybe hearing this and go, well, come on, Lewis and Harry Potter and all that, but I think one of the values you get by reading those, you learn to see things in it. Like, you read Lewis and you go, well, that's a great story, but you can't help as a Christian going, wait a minute, that's Jesus. And once you see metaphor and image, all of a sudden worlds open up. And once you get the habit of doing that, and then you read something else and you go, oh, there's more going on here. So I really don't think there's any loss in starting. We're not saying it's simple. It's a way to get into it and see literature is not something that you're reading just to get accomplished or just to get facts out of. You're looking to see depth into it. So I think it's a really powerful way to start.
Well, and another thing, if you need to get a win,
get a win. No, that's good.
If you need to get a W, you could go with some very, very fine short story writers. The Russian writer Nikolai Gogol. Those stories are outrageously weird and funny and disturbing. With your parents' permission, Franz Kafka.
I thought you were going to say Ulysses. Let's just stop.
No, we are now. See, that's the kale.
That's the kale.
All right, that's
poison in it. Maybe.
That's the kale. It's fine later. Or here's a big one.
Ulysses is never fine.
I want to go on record as saying that I disagree with Ty's statement. I want to throw out Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. If that doesn't spark a love of stories, Flannery O'Connor short stories.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah, I would say, too, really, this is kind of going with what Dan was just talking about, where you read in a community. One thing parents can do is you enter into this process, you say, what does my child love? And I will say that if Bruce is correct, there's a natural love for reading, but it has to be, we've got to find out how to sort of catalyze that, right? So I know what one of my sons loves. And then I start thinking, what book could he read that runs along the grain of his loves? So like Patrick O'Brien, Master and Commander. He loves history. he loves military things, and he loves stories about men. And so you can't do any better than Patrick O'Brien. And so, but I think there's something as a parent for finding those loves, and don't try to run across the grain, because that will come. Reading Aristotle is, not for me, but for a lot of people, is running across the grain of loves. But you do need to run along the grain of their loves.
It was that night for me, I can tell you.
Yeah. And I think, I know my children are very different, and I know that part of the love of reading is finding those things, and it's part of its taste, part of it is, character, part of it is just the interests as they've developed, part of it's ability, as Bruce said. Be very careful that you know the ability of your child. You want your child to have success. You don't, kid who's unathletic and struggles to play catch, you don't take the hard ball out and throw it 70 miles per hour, right? You toss it underhand, and the kid develops some confidence. And then, so it's a combination of running along the grain of their loves and finding out what they love. And parents, when we do that, our kids also see our investment in them as persons.
But you're saying that too for parents, right, Graham?
Yeah.
Like, parents should think of themselves. Where's my grain? What kind of things I enjoy? Because I think what people do when they think great books is it's got to be something esoteric and something I'm going to hate, rather than, and I think what you're all saying is, find the ones that really appeal inside of that and let that spur you on to read other things, which I think is a great way to bridge in.
Well, it's funny when we think of okay, so what is a great book? Well, one danger is to think, well, you've got to go immediately to Plato's Republic. But, I just read The Lost World with my students, and that book influenced Michael Crichton. And that's part of our great books curriculum. Sherlock Holmes. I mean, if you have a kid who really likes mystery, so Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, there's low-hanging fruit, as Bruce was saying, even short stories, even fairy tales. There are...
George MacDonald. Just read George MacDonald.
Yeah.
My goodness.
There really is a lot. There's a lot along the grain of our loves in great books. And I think that the intimidating piece is part of it. But then the other part is that we feel like, well, we haven't read a great book until we've suffered.
That's why Bruce has a Dostoevsky class, if you want to join him.
Bruce and I are two weirdos who our favorite book is The Brothers Karamazov. So,
Is that your favorite, Bruce?
Yeah, it's way up there.
yeah.
Oh,
I mean, I have
say.
to put the Bible up there
Yeah,
somewhere.
that was a test. You passed.
That's
that.
that's another.
I want to keep my
podcast.
job.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. So with this is why I call you Thun Bunch. I feel like this conversation could go on for years.
Well, let's head over to your place, Ty.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Well, but folks listening to the podcast, we're going to draw this, as Calvin would say, we're going to pull the curtain of decency across the conversation. I'm sure it will continue here, but thank you for listening in today. And parents, we know it's a challenging time. It's a time where there's so many forces in our culture that are taking you out into the shallows. And your children out into the shallows as well. That's the name of a book, which is really about what some of the things in our culture do to our kids' brain chemistry. I don't know how much of it to believe, but what I would say is one of the great things that you can give to your children educationally is teaching them to value permanent things. And that's what we love doing here at Veritas. So,
Amen.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much.
Ty.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to learn more about Veritas, visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.